decided not to answer yesterday because I already talked for 2 hours and I had another talk for 2 hours that evening, so I thought I would just keep it for today. This is a very good question, and I get this kind of question regularly, which is an indication that this is a regular experience in ordinary life in this society at this time. So it says, how can a person deal with obsessive thoughts or feelings of anxiety? So, yeah, high anxiety, continuous high anxiety, and the thoughts that go with it. Now, the thoughts are, you don't think thoughts of anxiety. You feel anxiety while you're thinking thoughts. You can't think of anxiety, but you think about thoughts which are dangerous to yourself, right? Something that threatens you. You think the thought that threatens you, and then anxiety rises. Or the reverse, very strangely. And I spoke about this last night, that the anxiety rises first without any thoughts attached to it. And then you fill in the thoughts afterwards. You feel afraid. And then you look around for the thing that makes you afraid. And we can see this in dreams, where we can see that the mind fills in a story later to explain feelings. So if you're asleep and dreaming just near dawn, and you hear there's in the dream, say, a bear is growling or chasing you or something like this, and you wake up. Sometimes you're fortunate enough you wake up, and sure enough, there's a truck outside the building making this growling sound. So you can see what the mind does with that. It has to explain the sound. Because it's dreaming, it's not very rational, its logic is weak, but it has to provide a scenario. So it invents a story to explain a sound, right, in a vivid way. So the mind also invents a story to explain a feeling. So when just basic, unfocused fear, which is anxiety, arises, then we have to develop a storyline to explain it, and the storyline often comes later. Of course, in ordinary life, there are sometimes situations that are genuinely threatening, and we feel fear rising from some very clear and present danger. As they say, clear and present danger. But the mind is tricky because it can run backwards and so forth. So unclear and uncertain, but the feeling of fear, and then one searches around in reverse, and then it has to provide a story for this. So the first thing is to never trust your thoughts while you have fear. Your thoughts are unreliable in fear and in anger. There are two types of emotions that distort the capacity to see things realistically in a balanced way, and which you may regret later if you act on them. So fear and anger. And so it's a really good. So you wake up in the middle of the night, you worry about something. It's very oppressive, and you feel in a difficult situation. And then you go back to sleep. Then the next day at 9 o'clock in the morning, after you have your coffee and you feel fully awake, you go over the situation. Not so bad. Simple matter. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's overwhelming. Why is that? Now, what should you learn from that? You should learn never trust your thoughts at 3 o'clock in the morning. Whatever you think and feel at 3 o'clock in the morning, do not believe. So the first thing is any thinking that you're going to act on, or many plans or believe in, it should be done when you're fully awake and after you've had your morning coffee. Then, secondly, beyond. So this is the first thing, and then secondly, even in the day when you're getting lost in an obsession about some thoughts, check your emotional content. See, people they don't realize how distorting emotions are with the actual facts of the case. So that's the thing to check over. Don't believe it if it's accompanied by hostility or fear. And so that, of course, you want to advise yourself about how to behave in the future, how to deal with situations. You want to give yourself, and of course, do you want bad advice or do you want good advice? I think you want good advice. I mean, if you walked into a doctor's office and had an ailment, and he suddenly burst into tears and began to tremble and so forth, you might think, I think I want another doctor. You want a cool, calm, and collected. The worse the situation is, the more you want cool, calm, and collected advice, right? You don't want distorted advice. So that's the same for yourself. You can't give yourself good advice in fear or anger. You can't give yourself good advice. So your first obligation is to free yourself from the emotion in order to solve the problem. And that's the step number one in solving the problem. Step one, you have a problem. First, articulate the problem. What is the problem? Step two, do not attempt to answer this problem. Step two is let go of the whole issue and the problem and see if you can produce a state of non-anxiety, non-fear. And only when the mind, and you feel it through your body, when you're calm, relaxed, at ease, then that's a trustworthy emotion. Whatever thoughts, the best of your thinking can be established then. And the decisions that you make in that mode should be written down. Do not just think them and I'll remember it. Because the magic is that when the emotions come back of fear or worry or anger, it will erase the contents of the previous decision. And therefore you need to write it down and document it. And thoughts formulated in anger or fear should not be written down. They should be forgotten as unreliable. It just can't record that data. It's not reliable. And so that is what we call making your own personal Bible. You have to make a document that is produced in the best of your emotional mind, and that's the one that overrides thoughts produced in anger or in fear. Yeah. And you just check that. Now, I learned this in a primitive way. I've learned it again and again and again and again and again and again. And it's not a theory anymore. I totally feel that it's the best method. But I learned it in a primitive way many, many years ago when I used to winter camp. I would go in Ontario camping in the middle of December and January and so forth. It'd be 30 and 40 below zero. And what I learned from the experience is your decision-making faculty when you're in a nice warm living room with a bunch of sleeping bags on the floor and a bunch of equipment on the floor has very little to do with what it really feels like at 30 below zero. And so you can't trust your mind in a comfortable situation to make the proper decisions. So what we end up doing was, and somehow you would, on a camping trip where you're out for days just snowshoeing around 30 below, you're sleeping outside in the snow and so forth, 30 below zero, you realize what you need and what you don't need, and it's very clear and very obvious. And you say, now, next time we must remember this. And it's very clear and very obvious, and you get back, and suddenly when you're nice and warm and everything, it all dissolves on you. And you're just about to go on the next trip and say, remember, didn't we say something about bringing something or not bringing something? Oh, well, it's probably not. We overrode the decision that was made in the appropriate situation, in the circumstances. So we realized we were doing this again and again. We get out there and say, we know we were supposed to bring that. We knew last time, you remember that? Now we canceled that decision in that nice warm living room. Now, what is going on here? How are we gonna manage our mind to do this? So we decided we would take a small notebook and write it down at 30 below zero, the instructions to those gentlemen in the nice warm living room. Listen to me. I speak the truth. You must bring this and don't bring that. Then we decided not to make this, never to override this notebook. So whatever it said, no matter how ludicrous it sounded in the nice warm living room, we would follow it anyway. And it worked perfectly. It worked perfectly with that. Now, and both of us were deeply religious skeptics, we suddenly understood the nature of the Bible. That what you're doing there is articulating sort of truths and data in the best of your emotional mind. And that is the one you've got to follow. And the other mind cannot be allowed to override. And that's something, it seems like a tedious thing, but it works. This is what they discovered in hospitals lately as well. In surgery structures, they were leaving pieces inside people, making all kinds of mistakes and errors, and having side events happening that shouldn't happen with surgeons and so forth. And there was a guy, an engineer, I think he was, from the University of Chicago, that wondered why all of these mistakes were happening in hospitals. And so what he asked was, well, how do people in other professions prevent this from happening? So we went to pilots, and they don't they don't look around and see if everything's okay. They go through a checklist, and whether they think they need to go through a checklist or not, they go through the checklist. And you just say to the next person, the light so-and-so is on, the light so-and-so is on. You just read it down the list. Even though you've done it 100 times, 1,000 times, you think you know, but you do it anyway, and this prevents huge amounts of accidents and so forth. So he introduced that into operating rooms and so forth. The incidence of mistakes went way, way down. And at first there was a lot of resistance. Doctors said, I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this for long. I don't need to read out an elementary list to everybody. It said, I don't want to do that, etc. And then, but they convinced them to do it anyway. So, did you wash your hands? You can't... You have to say out loud, yes, I washed my hands, etc. On and on. So this, in fact, reduced the whole structure greatly just by having to do that. That is the override list. So you can do this with emotion, because normally the ordinary tumult of the ordinary person's emotions and thoughts during the day are just very, very chaotic. And they're trying to use that at random to make important decisions in their life. So, since your life is important, you need structures and techniques for making the best decisions. And you got to know the fact of the emotional structure is the critical factor. Of course, it's always good as well to have an outside person to talk to who isn't in the mood that you're in, who is in a sort of calm and kindly, patient mood, and then to run the information by them so that you get another sort of voice from the outside. If you can't get a person, due to the miracle of technology, we have recordings. And just listening, this is called the voice of another. So the power of the voice of another person. So just listening to a talk on a topic that's close to it can pull you out of sometimes people have difficulty letting go of an emotion, right? So the voice of another, even if it's recorded, can pull you out of that particular mode of anxiety, and you feel like after it, with that help, you come out of the mode and you feel like you can look at the problem in a new light, you know. So just listening to a Dhamma talk, sometimes reading a book or an article can pull you into another mood, and so that's very helpful as well. And there are lots of Dhamma talks on our website. So, if you're nervous, having trouble sleeping at night, and you have a computer, punch on a Dhamma talk by me. I'll put you to sleep.
I have to say that's true, because I've done that when I couldn't sleep, and I don't want to put me to sleep.
Right, it gets to be a terrible habit. See, then when I give a tea time talk, you fall asleep. Conditioned, fall asleep.
I think a little bit with anxiety, sometimes it can be so automatic and can happen over and over, and you're not even aware, or you
Right.
notice it, and then you stop it. And sometimes there's no decision to go with it. It's a matter of something's the unknown.
Right. Well, that's also what most religious spiritual communities have. Usually 5 times a day they interrupt whatever they're doing to remember something. It's called a reflection and an interruption. So Benedictine monasteries, they stop just for a few minutes 5 times a day, and they say something out loud or recall something, whether they need it or not. That's how you stop this endless function of habit. You stop whatever you're doing. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, in his communities they have a bell that they ring from time to time, and it's not regular, but somebody just rings it, and everybody has to stop whatever they're doing at that moment for a minute or so and just collect themselves. Now, Bo is smiling at me because I'm just about to tell a story about Bo. Bo actually, and Sister Mon both have spent time with Thich Nhat Hanh in his community, and in his original community, or his original Western community outside of Paris. It's called Plum Village. Beautiful name. He's very poetic in his choice of words. Plum Village. Sounds good, doesn't it? You know, we should call this house Plum Village. So it was an old garbage dump or something that they bought, the Vietnamese expatriate community from the Vietnam War, and they turned it into a beautiful place of Dhamma, restored it. Anyway, in the early days, Bo was a great seeker of truth, and he went to see Thich Nhat Hanh in Plum Village and stayed there for some time. And he looked like the right man for the job of the mindfulness master. That is the man who rings the bell from time to time when he thinks people are becoming non-mindful. So he was given the bell, and every now and then when people are starting to chat and get carried away with things, ding-ling-ling, and everybody had to stop. I said, oh yes, no. Right. Yes. So that's, you have a living exemplar of the mindfulness master bell ringer right there. Yes.
Excuse me, fortunately, when I rang the bell, nobody listened. They would just laugh and carry on.
I thought you were going to say you forgot to ring the bell.
So that's, Islamic prayer is 5 times a day. the same. Punctuation, interruption, punctuation, and recollection. So that's something you just build in into your, all your gizmos can do that. Your little watch can go beep, beep. And when that goes beep, beep, you have to stop for at least a minute. Take a couple of breaths. There's always a minute. You can't be that busy where you can't stop for a minute, surely. Not that I'm calling you Shirley. There's no Shirley. You must be able to stop for a minute a few times a day, and that's called interruption. Now, as I was talking in the talk last night, I said also you should schedule into your life interruptions, not waiting for the time when you feel like going on retreat or going to a monastery or stepping out. You just schedule it in because you just know the nature of the mind. You start to get habitually into kind of a rushed feeling, a frantic mode, an anxiety mode, and you don't notice it. It just becomes normal. So you realize that you do not recognize these things. Therefore, you're going to have to build in mechanical interruptions to this. And then you can set it back to zero. You know, you go take a weekend off or a week off, you go and you restore yourself back so you can see. And again and again, we get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people coming through the monastery, and I have this conversation as they're about to depart, say, I really didn't know how wound up I was, you know. It's only when I got here that I realized, wow, I mean, I was just kind of lost in that, you know. So it's that. And so I tell them, now, well, you got to put it into your schedule. Don't wait for you to feel the right time, because the last thing you can do is feel the right time. You got to just make mechanical interruptions in it. Knowing that's the nature of the human mind, you get used to anything. People say they don't have time on this kind of stuff, but they don't realize that it's the opposite. You know, they don't really have time for anxiety, is what they shouldn't have time for. They don't really have time for just mindless busyness. That's not life. So there's a few techniques for interrupting and reducing anxiety. And they work, and they're well known throughout the world, and communities which dedicate themselves to trying to live in a sane fashion. They all use these techniques. This society does not know this technique. It's 24/7, uninterrupted, restless pursuit of something or other, and a kind of an addiction to the whole thing. There's got to be benefits for somebody behind all of this kind of hyperactivity. And in fact, of course, an anxious person is a good shopper. That's quite often ads are put right around the evening news, and of course news, which is, produces fear and pity. So this is Aristotle's. What is it that gets people's attention? Stories which produce the emotions of pity and fear. So the news is a commercial thing. It's not the government that's making the news. It's people who make a living off making the news, right? And they have how do they pay for the news? Through advertising. They know the stories must have fear and pity in them. And it grabs your attention. And then put the commercial about buying something near fear and pity, and it will connect in your mind, very powerful emotion. So they it's a good time for certain people to advertise. They know this around stories that produce anxiety, etc. So an anxious shopper is a good shopper. People, they want to get rid of, they go shopping, right? It's a channel device, etc. Even when the credit card is getting close to the max, there's still that kind of relief, so you go shopping, put on the credit card.
Isn't that the advice of President Bush? Just
go shopping.
Just after
9/11. Yeah, his advice.
Go to the mall.
Go shopping.
As a way of countering.
Yeah, kind of
terrorism.
to deny them their victory. Very strange idea. Don't let them don't show them you're afraid. Go shopping. That's how you do show you're afraid. You go shopping.